Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
So today we're tackling a really crucial global issue, but through a fascinating lens. Singapore. This nation, so dependent on trade, is basically walking a tightrope right now, with U.S.-China tensions ramping up, the whole global order shifting.
It's a precarious spot.
Exactly. And for our listeners who always want to get up to speed quickly and really understand these complex things, this deep dive should be a bit of a shortcut.
Yeah, we're trying to cut through the noise.
Our mission, then, is to unpack how Singapore is trying not to get marginalized, how it's working to protect its interests, its economy, in all this turbulence.
And we've looked at some solid expert analysis, laying out Singapore's options, what it has to do, really.
Okay, let's get into it then.
It really is remarkable, isn't it, how a small state like Singapore finds itself right at the center of these huge global shifts.
Yeah.
And the analysis we reviewed, it's pretty clear. Strategic neutrality is priority number one for them.
Strategic neutrality, okay.
Yeah, they just can't afford to pick a side, Not exclusively the U.S., not exclusively China.
It's not just sitting on the fence, though, is it?
No, not passive at all. It's described more as an active hedging strategy, trying to keep options open, maximize economic choice, especially if the world really does split into two camps.
It's a bifurcating world. That's the worry.
It's a huge challenge, a long-term balancing act.
Absolutely. It is delicate. I mean, Singapore has that long-standing free trade agreement with the U.S. Historically, zero tariffs. That's a big deal, a really significant link.
It was, yeah. Very important.
But here's where it gets, really interesting and kind of worrying for them, I imagine. Despite Singapore running a, $30 billion trade deficit with America, meaning they buy more from the U.S. than they sell.
Right.
The U.S. recently slapped on a 10% reciprocal tariff.
Yeah.
Just like that.
Wow. So much for the FTA protecting them completely.
Exactly. It just shows, doesn't it? These established agreements, they offer maybe limited protection when major powers decide to just shift policy unilaterally.
Yeah, it forces countries like Singapore to look beyond just those traditional alliances, I suppose.
So what do? They have to engage diplomatically, right?
Right.
Within the FTA framework?
Oh, definitely. Talking is crucial. But the idea of hitting back with their own tariffs?
Not an option.
Well, the analysis says it's just not viable. The economic self-harm would likely be way too severe.
Okay. And then on the other side, there's China.
Singapore's biggest trading partner.
The economic ties there are just incredibly deep. You've got all these interconnected supply chains running through the whole region.
Absolutely vital for them.
So the massive concern, the elephant in the room, is this potential U.S.-China decoupling, a real split in global trade.
Yeah, two separate blocks. That's the nightmare scenario for a trading hub.
So neutrality seems like the only path, but you mentioned it's an active strategy. How does that work?
Well, the sources suggest that by positioning itself as a kind of bridge, Singapore hopes it can keep access to both markets. Act as an intermediary, maybe facilitate trade between the two sides, but very carefully avoid getting dragged into their geopolitical fights.
It makes sense when you think about the alternative. What if they did pick a side?
Well, the analysis really flags the dangers there. If they align exclusively, say, with the U.S.,
China might retaliate.
Almost certainly, and vice versa. Plus, it would completely undermine their whole brand, their role as this trusted, neutral hub.
And we're seeing the real-world effects of this stuff already. The U.S. tariffs on China, some are over 60%.
Yeah, massive numbers. And even on Southeast Asia, tariffs ranging from 10% up to, nearly 50% in some cases.
It just shows the risks of this unilateral approach.
It really does. So for Singapore, being so reliant on trade, keeping those lines open with everyone.
Yeah.
It's not just a nice to have, it's survival.
Which kind of leads naturally to their second big strategy, doesn't it? Trying to shore up the rules-based system itself.
Exactly. Strengthening multilateral frameworks, things like the World Trade Organization.
Right, because when the WTO framework starts to erode, which we've seen happening, it hurts the smaller states like Singapore the most, right? They depend on those rules to level the playing field a bit.
Precisely. They don't have the sheer economic or political clout to dictate terms like the U.S. or China. They need this system to function.
And Singapore's been pushing for WTO reform for a while, haven't they? Especially the dispute settlement part, which is basically paralyzed.
Yeah, they've been quite vocal. And the sources highlight some specific actions they're taking. It's not just talk.
Like what?
Well, what's interesting is how proactive they are. They're teaming up with other like-minded countries. Australia, Japan were mentioned.
Okay.
To push things like digital trade agreements, trying to modernize the WTO rulebook for the 21st century.
And looking beyond the usual partners, too.
Definitely. Strategically expanding their own network of free trade agreements. Looking at regions like Latin America, Mercosur, the Pacific Alliance.
Yep.
Exactly. And forging new alliances, like with the Gulf Cooperation Council. It's all about creating more options, more trade routes, reducing that dependency on the very volatile U.S.-China relationship.
It's like building multiple safety nets.
That's a good way to put it. This investment in multilateralism, it's a long-term play, betting that a rules-based order, even an imperfect one, offers more stability than just relying on the whims of great powers.
And it contrasts sharply with what the U.S. is doing with its tariff regime, doesn't it? Moving away from that core WTO principle, the most favored nation treatment.
Absolutely. The MFN principle basically says you should treat all WTO members equally, offer them your best trading terms.
But these new U.S. tariffs are targeted, country-specific.
Right. It's a shift towards unilateralism, picking and choosing. And the sources really stress how important it is for Singapore to resist any pressure to do the same thing, to adopt similar protectionist policies.
Because that could lead to
a domino effect, a cascading global trade war. That's the fear, something nobody wants, especially not hyper-connected economies like Singapore.
Okay, so diplomacy, strengthening global rules. But what about the immediate economic hit? How are they preparing for that? That brings us to resilience, I guess.
That's right, building resilience. And they've set up this economic resilience task force.
A dedicated group.
Yeah, which shows they're taking it very seriously, very deliberately. Short term, the focus is on, well, monitoring, watching closely how these tariffs impact key sectors, electronics, pharmaceuticals, got specific mentions.
And helping businesses.
And providing fiscal aid, yeah. Helping businesses that are feeling the pinch, absorbing some of the shock.
But it's not just about patching things up now, is it? There's a longer view.
Oh, absolutely. The long-term strategy is about encouraging Singaporean companies to look further afield, explore non-traditional markets.
Like you mentioned, Latin America, Africa.
Exactly. And also, really importantly, building redundancy into supply chains.
Meaning not having all your eggs in one basket.
Precisely. So if one route gets disrupted, you have alternatives. It might be less efficient in the short term, but it's more secure. And there's also a big push on domestic innovation. Investing strategically in industries of the future green tech. Semiconductors are examples.
Trying to become less reliant on external shocks they can't control.
That's the goal. This focus on resilience, it's not just reacting. It feels like a proactive bet on a future that might be more fragmented, prioritizing long-term economic security, perhaps over maximum short-term efficiency.
And the sources actually gave some comparisons, didn't they? Potential GDP hits for places like Thailand and Poland from U.S. tariffs.
Yeah. Estimates like a 1% GDP loss for Thailand, 0.4% for Poland. It just highlights the potential damage and why Singapore is trying so hard to get ahead of it.
Okay, so they're managing the immediate economic fallout. But all this is happening against a backdrop of a much bigger shift, right? This idea of a changing world order, maybe even a post-Western one.
Right. Connecting it to the bigger picture. This emerging multipolar world, non-Western powers like China, India, gaining influence. That presents both opportunities and, well, challenges for a place like Singapore. Well, the sources point out that Singapore needs to be careful about just accepting Western-centric views of the world.
Okay.
Chandra Nair's perspective was mentioned, suggesting that sometimes Western institutions can be a bit dismissive of non-Western viewpoints. Or they frame conflicts in very stark good versus evil terms.
Moral binaries.
Exactly. Well, maybe downplaying historical context, like colonial legacies, for example.
So how does Singapore try to navigate that kind of shift?
The analysis emphasizes their push for more inclusive global governance.
What does that look like?
Things like supporting the expansion of the UN Security Council, making it more representative of today's world, and also really promoting ASEAN's way of doing things, the consensus-driven diplomacy.
The ASEAN way, giving smaller nations a collective voice.
Yes. It's a way to amplify their influence together.
And it sounds like they're deliberately trying to steer clear of ideological fights.
Very deliberately. You see the U.S. framing trade policies sometimes around democracy, while China talks a lot about sovereignty.
Two different narratives.
Right. And Singapore's approach is pragmatic, focused on rules, on engagement based on mutual interest. It lets them kind of sidestep those ideological traps that can be really divisive. Because
there's a risk, isn't there, that smaller states get pressured to just fall in line with one big power's agenda?
A huge risk of marginalization, yeah. So Singapore's constant emphasis on multilateralism, on ASEAN centrality, It's their way of pushing back, creating some balance.
Looking ahead then, it really feels like uncertainty is the name of the game.
It really is.
The sources mentioned Prime Minister Wong talking about domestic cohesion, vigilance.
That's a really critical point. Singapore has significant financial reserves, a history of social stability that's a huge buffer.
Yeah.
But the sources stress public awareness of the risks is vital. The population needs to understand the challenges the country is facing.
And it's not just about writing out the current storm. They're doing some serious scenario planning, thinking about worse outcomes.
Yes, pretty serious stuff. The sources even draw a rather sobering parallel to the 1930s.
The protectionism back then.
Which contributed to the environment that led to World War II. Now, nobody wants a repeat of history.
Of course not.
But Singapore has to consider the possibility that this U.S.-China trade conflict could escalate, maybe into something broader.
So they need to anticipate threats.
Major supply chain breaks, serious cyber threats, maybe more instability right in their own region, things like that.
Okay. So if we were to boil it down, recap the core strategies Singapore is using to navigate all this.
Right.
What are the key points?
Well, the key takeaways from our deep dive into these analyses seem pretty clear. First, trying to strengthen those multilateral frameworks, keep that rules-based order alive as much as possible.
Right.
Second, actively diversifying partnerships, looking beyond just the U.S. and China.
Building those new links.
Third, investing heavily in economic resilience.
Yeah.
Building buffers, encouraging innovation, preparing to absorb shocks. And finally, consistently advocating for a fairer, more inclusive system of global governance, making sure smaller voices are heard.
It really is a complex balancing act, no doubt about it. Singapore seems absolutely determined not to become, collateral damage in this shifting world order.
Charting their own course carefully.
Yeah. The goal, it looks like, is to position themselves as this reliable, trusted node, even if the global economy becomes more fractured.
Which leads us to maybe a final thought, something for our listeners to consider.
Okay.
Think about the wider implications here. Singapore's strategies, how might other small, trade-dependent nations facing similar pressures react? Would their approaches be similar? Different? What can we learn from how Singapore is trying to navigate this really profound uncertainty?
That's a great question to leave people with. How do other nations cope when the giants clash? Definitely something to think about.